The time period we call the Middle Ages began oh so long ago and ended oh so long before, and yet it continues to influence our ideas about the past, good, bad, and ugly. We're gonna look at 3 myths about the Middle Ages that just won't die. For our first myth, let's start with the classic: medieval people never bathed. This one refuses to die, like a stubborn medieval wart. Yes, medieval Europe didn't have daily hot showers with cucumber-scented body wash. Things were different then. Your average village didn't have indoor plumbing. But to imagine everyone just waddling around caked in filth is ridiculous. In fact, public bathhouses were common in many towns, some as fancy as a medieval spa day complete with a swimming pool and massage parlor. The wealthy elite also had private baths at home, while peasants might wash in rivers or wooden tubs when they could. But wait, don't all those images of malodorous peasants and aristocrats lounging in their bathhouses prove the myth? Not quite. While some lords and ladies did reek, the general rule was that people bathed weekly or even more often. And soap, usually made from animal fat and ash, was widely available and used. Medieval folks cared about smelling decent. So where did this everyone stank idea come from? Mostly from the late Middle Ages and early modern periods when plagues made public baths seem like a risky activity. Some moralists also frowned on baths because, well, they could be a little too fun. Some bathhouses doubled as discreet meeting spots for, shall we say, less than pure activities. But medieval folks had perfume oils, scented gloves, and herbal sachets, and chroniclers complained about overly perfumed nobles. Not exactly the mental image of a mud-crusted peasant swamp. So if you believe medieval people were permanently marinated in sweat, sorry your Hollywood history teacher lied. For our next myth, we'll travel from the smelly streets of medieval Europe to its equally aromatic stables. Ah yes, horses were much bigger in the Middle Ages. Once upon a time, Disney's version of a war horse probably looked something like this: a noble steed the size of a house with enough bulk to trample a small child in a single stride. And compared to most modern horses, medieval beasts were bigger, broader, and taller, but not so much bigger. Take a look at this famous medieval sculpture of a rearing horse. Majestic, yes, but hardly towering over its medieval viewer. Remember, these supposed giants were still bred from the same stock as today's horses and ponies. And they grew up eating the same fodder, mostly grain and the occasional bit of hay. So why does everyone think they were larger than life? Probably because medieval art likes to make horses bigger to emphasize their power and importance. There's also the fact that ancient texts talk about huge war horses, from fabulous steeds ridden by Roman emperors to monstrous cavalry mounts from Greek mythology. But if you take a close look at medieval paintings, you can see the artists weren't trying to capture the exact likeness of a real horse. They were stylizing it for effect. So, unless you've been holding your breath, waiting for a gentle giant to amble through your front door, you can stop dreaming of riding a 16-hand high palfrey into battle. Sorry, that's just a horse the size of a pony. For our final myth, let's talk about the ultimate medieval monster. No, not that one, the other one. Women couldn't inherit property. From King Arthur's sister Morgan to the 7-year-old Matilda, England's first queen regnant, women certainly inherited stuff in the Middle Ages. In fact, inheritance was one of the few ways a woman could secure her financial future, because most could unown property in their own right. That's not to say it never happened. England's Queen Elizabeth I famously owned half of all the deer in England, while aristocratic women sometimes inherited manors, farms, and even castles. But most women couldn't own property. This myth's origin might seem obvious. After all, the restriction appears in the Bible and echoes through many medieval laws and customs. But it also has roots in classical antiquity and ancient Rome. But that doesn't mean medieval men ruled the roost everywhere. In some places, women could own property. When it came to inheritance, local customs varied across medieval Europe, and in some regions, laws were more favorable to women than others. For example, in northern France, daughters got the same inheritance as sons. So if you think medieval women never owned property, that's news to many historians. So there you have it, 3 medieval myths that just won't die. Do you believe these myths? Let us know down below. And if you want to learn more about medieval life, click here. I have said it before, and I will say it again. You can't make up these titles. Here's another crowd favorite. A knight in full armor couldn't get up if they fell over. And like our other recent episode, this one is so wrong it's embarrassing. A suit of late medieval plate armor weighed around 45 to 55 pounds. That's about the same as a modern military backpack, helmet, and rifle. That's a workout, sure, but it didn't glue them to the ground like an upside-down turtle. Real knights trained constantly to fight, ride, and yes, get up in armor. There are even surviving training manuals showing knights vaulting onto horses in full kit. They could run, climb ladders, wrestle, and more. Armor was cleverly designed to distribute weight across the body, not just pile it on your shoulders. Okay, so why do we think that knights couldn't move in their armor? Well, part of the problem is that most people think about medieval armor as something that looks like this, big and bulky and decorative. But this type of armor was actually meant to be worn by a king or queen during a parade or a ceremony. It wasn't really designed for battle. These days we call them parade harnesses or show harnesses, and they're basically the armor equivalent of high heels. They look great, but they're not super practical. The other part of the problem is that real medieval armor is really expensive and really time-consuming to make. So when it came time to make a movie or a play set in the Middle Ages, the budgets were usually really tight. So the armorers would often make oversized, decorative pieces that looked impressive from a distance but were actually really uncomfortable and restrictive to move in. These are the kinds of pieces that we're talking about when we say that knights couldn't move in their armor. They couldn't move because they were made to be immobile. So let's take a closer look at some of this so-called mobile armor. This is a great example of a piece of armor that was designed for a parade or a ceremony. It's called a barding, and it was used to cover a horse from front to back. The front piece is called an overlay, and it has all these cool little details like the sun and the moon on the side here. But let's focus on the back piece. See those four guys carrying the thing? Yeah, it's not light. It's also really stiff and inflexible, which makes it really hard to move around in. This back piece weighs around 33 pounds by itself, almost as much as the entire armor of an average medieval knight. And that's before you put the overlay on top. Here's another example. This is a breastplate and backplate from the 16th century. Again, these are way bigger than a knight would actually wear into battle. Notice how the sides of the breastplate come out really wide. That's so that the armor can add decoration to it, but it also means that the knight wearing it would have a really hard time raising his arms. Knights wouldn't be able to turn their heads very far either because of the big neck loop. And forget about bending down to pick up your sword if it fell off its hanger. With these giant metal wings on your back, you'd probably just fall on your face. Finally, let's look at this helmet. These are called visor doors, and they were worn by Swiss pikemen in the 18th century. This particular one was probably owned by a wealthy family because it's made of copper instead of iron. But even though it's lighter and softer, it still makes it really hard to see out of. Try putting a piece of cardboard over your head and then trying to charge into battle while someone stabs at you with a spear. Not easy. So no, medieval battles weren't just a bunch of knights lying on their backs waiting to be poked with spears. That would have been a very short war. Thanks for watching. You know what? If I had a coin for every time somebody said medieval people thought you'd fall off the edge of the earth, I would have enough money to buy myself a really nice medieval bathhouse session. But the truth is, educated people in the Middle Ages knew that the earth was round. This knowledge came from ancient Greeks like Aristotle and Ptolemy, preserved and expanded upon by Islamic scholars. Even early medieval sailors understood the concept. They navigated using the curve of the horizon. The idea that medieval people were so ignorant they thought the world was flat is a relatively modern myth, one that became popular in the 19th century when certain writers wanted to paint the Middle Ages as a time of pure ignorance, all to make themselves feel more enlightened. And it's the same smug attitude that gave us paintings of cavemen dragging women by the hair. Sure, not every peasant was doing spherical trigonometry, but they weren't terrified of sailing into the void either. In fact, medieval people were more worried about sea monsters or running out of beer on long voyages. But why do so many people believe this persistent myth? Part of the reason is that medieval maps sometimes depict the world as a T-shaped sheet, and that looks an awful lot like a flat Earth if you do and know what you're looking at. But those maps aren't really maps at all. They're representations of a medieval worldview, one that uses familiar human-centered terms like north and south, even though the Earth isn't flat. Medieval cartographers drew the north at the top and the south at the bottom because that is how people generally face when they pray. And those two-shaped maps were usually used as templates for creating actual portolan charts, which did accurately depict the curved surface of the Earth. There was also plenty of misinformation floating around in the Middle Ages, but rarely was the shape of the Earth called into question. There are a few famous stories that seem to support the myth, such as that of a young girl named Hereward who supposedly asked a monk why ships didn't fall off the edge of the world, but these tales aren't based on fact. The story of Hereward comes from a letter written by a 16th century Protestant leader, who included the tale as an example of how ignorant Catholics were. And there's no evidence that such an exchange ever took place. It's true that some prominent medieval thinkers grappled with the shape of the Earth, such as the English monk John Wycliffe, whose translation of the Bible into English replaced round with broad when referring to the Earth. But he did this because he literally translated the word compacta, which in Latin can mean both round and broad. Wycliffe wasn't rejecting scientific knowledge. He simply preferred to use more literal translations. So where did this whole myth come from? Well, the earliest iteration appears in a satirical piece written by the Greek-Roman satirist Lucian about a fictional flat Earth society. But it was until the 19th century that writers began spreading the myth of the ignorant medieval flat earther. And they did so for a number of reasons. First, it allowed them to distance themselves from the perceived backwardness of the Middle Ages by emphasizing the supposed flat Earth beliefs of our medieval ancestors. Writers could paint themselves as more modern and progressive. Second, the myth helped to reinforce negative stereotypes about medieval peasants as superstitious and uneducated. And third, by portraying medieval people as ignorant about the shape of the Earth, writers could imply that they were similarly uninformed about other scientific matters. This served to bolster the perception of the Middle Ages as a time of darkness and ignorance, paving the way for further Enlightenment-era stereotypes. The result has been a distorted view of medieval culture that persists to this day. When we think of medieval people, we often imagine them as superstitious, ignorant flat earthers, when in reality they were more concerned with things like where to get good ale. Thanks for watching. They say that good is good and evil is evil. But what about when good and evil get together? Maybe you get a fun-loving sociopath. Well, actually, you get the Black Death, but aside from that, plenty of things throughout history have been considered both good and evil, like alcohol, religion, and these guys. Yes, we're talking about medieval lords again. See, when we think of medieval lords, we usually picture stern taskmasters beating peasants for trying to steal their piece of bread or worse, claiming the first night with the bride on her wedding night. Whoa, hold on, what? Are we supposed to believe that medieval lords really did this? Well, let's examine the evidence. It all starts with this drawing by a guy named Remy de Souris, who lived during the First Crusade. He drew this horizontal design known as a tondo, which depicts a lord taking the first night with a bride. The drawing itself isn't exactly shocking, but here's the kicker. We don't actually know if he meant for it to be shocking. See, tondos were a popular genre of art in Italy during the Middle Ages. They were often used to illustrate manuscripts for wealthy patrons, and they usually depicted scenes from mythology or biblical stories. Sometimes they even put religious figures in the naughty bits. So it might seem weird to us now, but back then it was totally normal for artists to include sex in their religious works. That's why when you see a depiction of the Virgin Mary in the Middle Ages, she's usually wearing 14th century lingerie. So given that this guy made a career drawing pictures of sexy religious figures, maybe he didn't mean for the Lord in his picture to literally be taking the bride away from her husband on their wedding night. Maybe it was just a picture of a lord collecting some taxes. You see, back in the Middle Ages, if you wanted to get married, you often had to pay a fee to your local lord. This fee varied depending on the region, but usually it wasn't much. The lord was unallowed to charge an exorbitant amount because the bride and groom had already paid a church fee to get married. But still, the fee existed and the bride and groom had to part with a little cash to get hitched. In most cases, the bride and groom were poor peasants, while the lord was filthy rich. And I am sure you can imagine how the lords felt when those dirty peasants came to their castle to pay their marriage tax. Yep, they totally ripped them off. They took the money and sent them on their merry way, and the peasants had no choice but to comply. If they didn't pay the marriage tax, they couldn't get married, which meant they couldn't start their family, which meant they wouldn't produce more workers for the lord's fields. So paying the tax was in their best interest. Now, the taxman may not be the most fun position at the king's court, but it was important work. The king needed those tax dollars to fund his army and go on crusades and stuff. So someone had to collect that money. But over time, the job started to take on a life of its own. People began to believe that the king owned the peasants and that they had to do whatever he asked of them. Some even believed that the king had the right to take the bride on her wedding night. And that's how we got this thing called the first night. It's a corruption of the tax system, a misunderstanding of feudalism, and the worst case of mistaken identity since a very famous mix-up in Shakespeare's Othello. But despite that, it's still one of the most persistent myths about the Middle Ages. In fact, you can even find it in modern pulp fiction books. Oh, hey, it's the knight from our Ren Fair skit. Come to slay the dragon of bad history facts. Fear not, maidens, for I am here to deliver. That's a good one, maidens. Very funny. Geez, get your mind out of the gutter. But seriously, folks, this whole thing started as a misunderstanding, and it's only gotten crazier as time went on. But one thing's for sure, medieval lords weren't claiming brides on their wedding nights. Or at least there's no evidence that they were, so count this as one debunked myth. We'll tell you another one next time. Until then, keep learning. In the Middle Ages, most people died young. This one is sneaky because it sounds like a statistic. You'll often hear that the average life expectancy was 30, but averages can be deceptive. That number is low mainly because of high infant mortality. A lot of children didn't survive past age 5, which drags the average way down. If you made it past childhood, you could live into your 50s, 60s, or beyond, just like today, except without antibiotics and dental floss. Plenty of medieval records mention people in their 70s and 80s. Of course, your odds depended heavily on your status, location, and luck. War, famine, and disease could cut lives short, but they didn't have some built-in expiration date at 30. So why does everyone keep dying at 30? They don't. Welcome to my channel. Today we're talking about death in the Middle Ages. If you'd like to ask us any questions about this time period, you can do so using the hashtag provided. Also, if you've been enjoying our videos, please consider liking and subscribing to help us out. We really appreciate it. Thanks. Medieval people certainly died young on average, but this was mostly because of how many kids died. The chances of dying before the age of 5 were around 40%. So, if you had a kid, there's a pretty good chance they wouldn't make it to adulthood. This was due to things like a lack of clean water and the inability to properly treat illnesses. It's easy to see why so many children died young. But with all those things combined, it makes sense that the average life expectancy was around 30, but this isn't really that accurate for the entire population. If you made it to adulthood, your life expectancy actually increased significantly. In fact, 30-year-olds in the Middle Ages actually had a higher life expectancy than 30-year-olds today. It might sound crazy, but this is true. Once you made it to the age of 30, you had a 50-50th chance of living to the age of 60, and 10% of 30-year-olds would live to be 80. While that might not sound like a big deal today, remember that this was a time period without modern medicine. But how could so many people live to be that old without modern medicine? Well, a lot of it had to do with lifestyle. People in the Middle Ages were much more active than we are today. They walked everywhere, did manual labor, and didn't have things like cars or elevators. All this activity might have contributed to their longevity. It's also possible that medieval people were stronger and more resilient than we are today. After all, they had to be. Life in the Middle Ages was tough, and you had to be in good health to survive. Finally, medieval people probably had better diets than we do today. Obviously, there's no fast food or processed foods, but medieval people ate a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables. They also consumed dairy products and grains. Their diets were definitely not perfect, but they were probably healthier than ours. Of course, life expectancy varied widely depending on where you lived, your social status, and just dumb luck. People who lived in cities tended to die younger than those in the countryside because cities were more crowded and unsanitary. The same goes for people who were poor. They were more likely to die from things like starvation and disease. And of course, if you were unfortunate enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, you could die from things like war or natural disasters. So the next time you hear that the average life expectancy in the Middle Ages was 30, don't believe it. While it's true that most people died young, this was mostly because of high infant mortality. If you made it to adulthood, you had a pretty good chance of living into your old age. So don't worry, the next time you walk past a graveyard and see all the headstones, just remember that most of those people died before the age of 5. Only a small percentage made it to their 30s, but that doesn't mean they didn't have long lives. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video and check out our other videos. Ask us your questions using the hashtag provided. And until next time, stay awesome. When you think of a witch in a medieval village, what do you picture? Maybe a hunched old woman stirring a cauldron, muttering spells and planning to put a curse on you if you don't stay perfectly still. Or maybe she's being dragged through the streets by an angry mob, only to be tied up and burned at the stake. Well, the second image might be more accurate than you think. After all, the medieval period was known for its witch trials and burnings. And there are plenty of stories about poor witches being persecuted and killed, right? Well, yes, but also no. The idea of an entire era of medieval life consumed by the fear of witches and the obsession with burning them is actually mostly a modern invention. It wasn't until the 16th century that the belief in witches became widespread enough to cause mass hysteria, resulting in hundreds of thousands of people being put to death across Europe. The large-scale witch hunts happened well after the Middle Ages ended. So it's time to separate fact from fiction and find out just how many witches were burned during this era. First off, let us talk about the time period itself, because calling 1,000 years of history medieval is like calling 1,000 years of America colonial. A lot can happen in 1,000 years, and the early Middle Ages were very different from the late Middle Ages. From around 500 AD to 1000 AD, Europe was figuring itself out. As the Roman Empire fell and new kingdoms rose, there were definitely some powerful women who were called witches by their enemies. But most people didn't really believe in witchcraft at this point. The idea of a magical, maybe even satanic panic didn't start taking off until much later. In fact, it was until the 8th century that the church officially declared that believing in witches was pagan nonsense. People could still be accused of witchcraft for things like causing someone harm, but these accusations were usually pretty rare. As the Dark Ages gave way to the High Middle Ages, Europe experienced a few hundred years of peace and prosperity. But then came the 1340s and the Black Death. When a plague kills millions of people, people look for someone to blame. Jews were often persecuted for poisoning wells, and people started getting accused of witchcraft again. By the end of the century, the fear of witches was back in full force, and things would only get worse. During the early modern period, religious tension and political instability led to more accusations of witchcraft than ever before. This was also when beliefs about witches changed. People began to think that witches weren't just evil, they were actively conspiring with the devil himself. And where there's a devil, there's bound to be fire and brimstone. Between the 5th, 10th, and 17th centuries, hundreds of thousands of people were put to death for witchcraft across Europe. This included the infamous Salem witch trials in the New World. But here's the thing, those aren't the medieval witch trials. Sure, the late medieval period saw more persecution of supposed witches than any other part of the Middle Ages, But the stereotype of the medieval village burning witches every weekend isn't true. We think of witches being burned at the stake. But throughout most of the Middle Ages, accused witches were more likely to be fined, imprisoned, or shunned by their community. One reason for this is that burning witches was actually pretty expensive. Wood was expensive, and so was the wax that was used to light fires. So even though we think of witches being burned all the time, drowning was a much more common punishment. And we should know all of this because most of the surviving records about medieval witch trials come from one guy, a Dominican friar named Heinrich Kramer, who wrote a book called The Hammer of the Witches. And that's like the instruction manual for witch hunters. What's scary is that he's super into the whole witch burning thing. But his book is basically the reason why we have this idea of medieval witch burnings today. The thing is, he's not really giving us a first-hand account of what happened in medieval villages. He's just writing a guidebook for people who want to go out and find witches, and he wants them to burn. So what did actual medieval villages do? They tried to ignore the whole witchcraft thing. Mostly, your neighbors gossiping about you having weird herbs in your garden was annoying, but it wasn't usually dangerous. But if you were accused of being a witch, it was important to keep a low profile. Now, this meant that most people accused of witchcraft didn't leave behind much documentation. We don't know exactly how many people were accused, let alone killed for witchcraft during the Middle Ages, but the number was almost certainly lower than in later periods. What's clear is that early modern Europe was way more afraid of witches than the medieval period. So while the Middle Ages had their share of superstition, it wasn't the non-stop pyromaniac festival people imagine. Most medieval witches probably spent more time hiding from nosy neighbors than dodging torch-wielding mobs. Now check out why the Salem witch trials really happened, or watch this video instead. For some reason, a lot of people think that medieval meals consisted of boiled cabbage, stale bread, and maybe, just maybe, if you were lucky, a single questionable piece of salted meat. In reality, medieval cuisine could be surprisingly flavorful, especially if you were a noble or a merchant. Yes. Spices like cinnamon, saffron, ginger, pepper, and cloves were prized across medieval Europe and widely traded along major and minor routes. Yes, they were expensive, but nobles and merchants bought them not just to add flavor to their diet, but to show off their wealth. Even peasants had flavor in their diets. Herbs like parsley, sage, and thyme grew easily, and dried herbs could be bought at the market. Onions, leeks, and garlic were also staples in most European cuisines. These ingredients may not sound very exciting, but medieval cooks used them to make hearty stews, oat-based pottages, and fresh bread when grain supplies allowed. The medieval food was bland. Myth probably comes from people imagining a Europe cut off from the spice trade, which wasn't true until certain wars and plague outbreaks in the 14th and 15th centuries temporarily slowed it. So no, medieval people didn't season their food with just sadness and mud. Some recipes from the 14th century look like medieval MasterChef material, minus the screaming judges. Today we're going to try one of them out. This recipe is from a cookbook called The Falm of Curry, Courtesy, being a collection of ancient and modern receipts, wherein the art of cookery is set forth. It was published in 1564, so it's a bit after the Middle Ages. But since cookbooks often had recipes passed down from previous centuries, this fits nicely into our time period. And since it's a book about receipts, there are lots of options for substitutions, so let's get started. We'll need some mutton, half a pound of currants, half a pound of raisins, 3 ounces of ginger, a 1/4 ounce of saffron, 4 cloves, 1 whole nutmeg, a 1/4 ounce of mace, 2 bay leaves, salt, and pepper. Now before we begin, we should point out that this recipe requires some special equipment, specifically a liquor, a spice, and a braising pot. If you don't have these things, you can kind of wing it, but your results may vary. First, take your meat and cut it up into small bits. Then put the meat into your braising pot. Add 2 cloves and pour boiling water over everything. Let it sit for 4 hours. Next, take half a pound of currants and half a pound of raisins and wash them. Then drain them and put them in your pot. Add half an ounce of ginger, a 1/4 ounce of saffron, 3 cloves and 1 bay leaf, salt, and pepper to taste. Cover the pot and braise it for 1 hour. While that's going on, chop up the rest of your ginger and put it into your spice, then add the nutmeg and mace. Grind everything together and set it aside. After an hour, remove the pot from the heat and take some of the hot liquor and mix it into the ground spices. Pour that back into the pot, then add the remaining bay leaf and boil it for 10 minutes. Now it's ready to serve. Remember how we said you could substitute ingredients? Well, here's where that comes in. Depending on what sort of spices you can find or afford, you can adjust the recipe accordingly. But why would anyone want to do that? This dish sounds amazing as is. Medieval cuisine has gotten a bad rap throughout history, but really it was full of flavor. Sure, there were some bland foods in the medieval diet, but that's true of any cuisine. Medieval cooks had plenty of options to make their dishes taste great, and they took full advantage of them. So next time someone says medieval food was bland, just break your bread, sprinkle it with salt, and eat it. Then tell them, you would have liked it? Or don't. That's rude. Don't do that. A common claim you hear about the Middle Ages is that people were all 5 feet tall because nutrition was terrible. Is there any truth to this? Well, it turns out that the average medieval man was about 5 foot 7 inches, give or take, and women were around 5 foot 2 inches to 5 foot 4 inches. This is according to an analysis of archaeological skeletons from various European sites published in the journal Antiquity in 2019. These measurements are pretty similar to the global average heights of men and women today, which are around 5 foot 9 inches and 5 foot 3 inches respectively. So why does everyone think that medieval folk were a bunch of munchkins then? One reason is that people tend to focus on the worst examples of famine and poor harvest years, like the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when unusually cold and wet weather led to widespread crop failure across Europe. In England, the price of a quarter of wheat rose from 15 shillings to £5. People resorted to eating the bodies of small animals, hedgehogs, cats, dogs, anything they could catch or keep alive through the winter. In some cases, adults were reduced to drinking urine to try to prevent dehydration and kidney failure. No wonder some people from that era are now believed to have been as short as 4 feet, 9 and 2 inches. But these extreme cases of famine and starvation don't tell the whole story. According to the Smithsonian, in more stable regions of Europe, like Burgundy and southern Germany, medieval diets, consisting of bread, grains, dairy, vegetables, and yes, even some meat, thanks to the introduction of the three-field system of agriculture, which allowed for greater crop diversity and healthier diets, supported healthy growth. And speaking of diet, it can be really helpful to know what you're getting into when you eat something new. Thanks to the science-backed daily insights, I learned that even though red meat is high in heme iron, which is more bioavailable than non-heme iron found in plants, it can actually reduce the absorption of non-heme iron if eaten together. So to maximize my iron intake, it makes sense to avoid having beef and broccoli together, but instead have them at separate meals. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the conflicting nutrition advice out there, but with a personalized plan from a dietitian and daily insights based on the latest scientific research, you can make informed food and lifestyle choices that work for you. Another reason that people think medieval folks were short is that they often cite small medieval doorways as evidence. But small doorways were actually built for insulation, not because people were hobbit-sized. Keep in mind that homes in the Middle Ages were often made of stone, a material that conducts heat really well. Making the doorways smaller meant that less cold air could come in during the winter. In fact, homes in the Middle Ages might have had the same heating and cooling challenges we do today. A team of researchers from the University of Uppsala recreated a medieval house in Sweden and found that temperatures inside the home could vary by as much as 20 degrees Celsius between day and night. Finally, the idea that medieval people were short also does hold up if we look at the clothing and armor from the time. Many pieces from that era still fit modern bodies just fine, even if those bodies are a little soft, thanks to the invention of padded chairs and couches. So next time you hear someone say, people back then were tiny, consider that they were probably just as tall as your uncle who claims he is 6 feet but mysteriously shrinks to 5'9" at the doctor's office. Speaking of mysterious shrinking, have you ever wondered what happened to the dodo bird? Or where all the missing socks go? We made a whole video about that. You can watch it right here on this channel.